Good evening, members. The candles have been lit. The fire burns low. Outside, the house has grown quiet. For this evening's ghostly gathering, I have selected 4 stories in which forgotten places refuse to surrender their memories, and the dead are never quite as distant as we might hope. An abandoned orchard, a lonely gate, an unexpected visitor, and shadows that remember what the living cannot. Please make yourself comfortable. Tonight's ghostly gathering begins. The Haunted Orchard. Spring was once more in the world. As she sang to herself in the far-away woodlands, her voice reached even the ears of the city, weary with the long winter. Daffodils flowered at the entrances to the subway. Furniture-removing vans blocked the side streets. Children clustered like blossoms on the doorsteps. The open cars were running, and the cry of the cash clo man was once more heard in the land. Yes, it was the spring, and the city dreamed wistfully of lilacs and the dewy piping of birds in gnarled old apple trees, of dogwood lighting up with sudden silver the thickening woods, of water plants unfolding their glossy scrolls in pools of morning freshness. On Sunday mornings, the outbound trains were thronged with eager pilgrims, hastening out of the city to behold once more the ancient marvel of the spring. And on Sunday evenings, the railway termini were aflower with banners of blossom from rifled woodland and orchard, carried in the hands of the returning pilgrims, whose eyes still shone with the spring magic, in whose ears still sang the fairy music. And as I beheld these signs of the vernal equinox, I knew that I, too, must follow the music, forsake a while the beautiful siren we call the city, and in the green silences meet once more my sweetheart's solitude. As the train drew out of the Grand Central, I hummed to myself, "I've a neater, sweeter maiden in a greener, cleaner land." And so I said goodbye to the city and went forth with a beating heart to meet the spring. I had been told of an almost forgotten corner on the south coast of Connecticut, where the spring and I could live in an inviolate loneliness, a place uninhabited save by birds and blossoms, woods and thick grass, and an occasional silent farmer, and pervaded by the breath and shimmer of the sound. Nor had rumour lied, for when the train set me down at my destination, I stepped out into the most wonderful green hush, a leafy Sabbath silence through which the very train, as it went farther on its way, seemed to steal as noiselessly as possible for fear of breaking the spell. After a winter in the town, to be dropped thus suddenly into the intense quiet of the countryside makes an almost ghostly impression upon one, as of an enchanted silence, a silence that listens and watches but never speaks, finger on lip. There is a spectral quality about everything upon which the eye falls. The woods, like great green clouds, the wayside flowers, the still farmhouses, half lost in orchard bloom, all seem to exist in a dream. Everything is so still, everything so supernaturally green. Nothing moves or talks except the gentle susurrus of the spring wind, swaying the young buds high up in the quiet sky, or a bird now and again, or a little brook singing softly to itself among the crowding rushes. Though from the houses one notes here and there are evidently human inhabitants of this green silence. None are to be seen. I have often wondered where the country folk hide themselves, as I have walked hour after hour past farm and croft and lonely dooryards, and never caught sight of a human face. If you should want to ask the way, a farmer is as shy as a squirrel, and if you knock at a farmhouse door, all is as silent as a rabbit warren. As I walked along in the enchanted stillness, I came at length to a quaint old farmhouse, old colonial in its architecture, embowered in white lilacs and surrounded by an orchard of ancient apple trees which cast a rich shade on the deep spring grass. The orchard had the impressiveness of those old religious groves, dedicated to the strange worship of sylvan gods, gods to be found now only in Horace or Catullus, and in the hearts of young poets, to whom the beautiful antique Latin is still dear. The old house seemed already the abode of solitude. As I lifted the latch of the white gate and walked across the forgotten grass, and up onto the veranda already festooned with wistaria, and looked into the window, I saw solitude sitting by an old piano, on which no composer later than Bach had ever been played. In other words, the house was empty, and going round to the back, where old barns and stables leaned together as if falling asleep, I found a broken pane, and so climbed in and walked through the echoing rooms. The house was very lonely. Evidently no one had lived in it for a long time. Yet it was all ready for some occupant, for whom it seemed to be waiting. Quaint old four-poster bedsteads stood in 3 rooms, dimity curtains and spotless linen, old oak chests and mahogany presses, and opening drawers in Chippendale sideboards. I came upon beautiful, frail old silver and exquisite china that set me thinking of a beautiful grandmother of mine, made out of old lace and laughing wrinkles and mischievous old blue eyes. There was one little room that particularly interested me, a tiny bedroom all white, and at the window the red roses were already in bud. But what caught my eye with peculiar sympathy was a small bookcase in which were some 20 or 30 volumes, wearing the same forgotten expression, forgotten and yet cared for, which lay like a kind of memorial charm upon everything in the old house. Yes, everything seemed forgotten, and yet everything, curiously, even religiously, remembered. I took out book after book from the shelves. Once or twice flowers fell out from the pages, and I caught sight of a delicate handwriting here and there and frail markings. It was evidently the little intimate library of a young girl. What surprised me most was to find that quite half the books were in French. French poets and French romances, a charming, very rare edition of Ronsard, a beautifully printed edition of Alfred de Musset, and a copy of Théophile Gautier's Mademoiselle de Maupin. How did these exotic books come to be there alone in a deserted New England farmhouse? This question was to be answered later in a strange way. Meanwhile, I had fallen in love with the sad, old, silent place, and as I closed the white gate and was once more on the road, I looked about for someone who could tell me whether or not this house of ghosts might be rented for the summer by a comparatively living man. I was referred to a fine old New England farmhouse, shining white through the trees a quarter of a mile away. There I met an ancient couple, a typical New England farmer and his wife. The old man, lean, chin-bearded, with keen grey eyes flickering occasionally with a shrewd humour. The old lady with a kindly old face of the withered apple type and ruddy. They were evidently prosperous people, but their minds, for some reason I could not at the moment divine, seemed to be divided between their New England desire to drive a hard bargain and their disinclination to let the house at all. Over and over again, they spoke of the loneliness of the place. They feared I would find it very lonely. No one had lived in it for a long time, and so on. It seemed to me that, afterwards, I understood their curious hesitation, but at the moment only regarded it as a part of the circuitous New England method of bargaining. At all events, the rent I offered finally overcame their disinclination, whatever its cause. And so, I came into possession, for 4 months, of that silent old house with the white lilacs and the drowsy barns, and the old piano, and the strange orchard. And, as the summer came on, and the year changed its name from May to June, I used to lie under the apple trees in the afternoons, dreamily reading some old book, and through half-sleepy eyelids, watching the silken shimmer of the Sound. I had lived in the old house for about a month, when one afternoon a strange thing happened to me. I remember the date well. It was the afternoon of Tuesday, June 13th. I was reading, or rather dipping here and there, in Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. As I read, I remember that a little unripe apple, with a petal or two of blossom still clinging to it, fell upon the old yellow page. Then, I suppose, I must have fallen into a dream, though it seemed to me that both my eyes and my ears were wide open, for I suddenly became aware of a beautiful young voice singing very softly somewhere among the leaves. The singing was very frail, almost imperceptible, as though it came out of the air. It came and went fitfully, like the elusive fragrance of a sweetbriar, as though a girl was walking to and fro, dreamily humming to herself in the still afternoon. Yet there was no one to be seen. The orchard had never seemed more lonely, and another fact that struck me as strange was that the words that floated to me out of the aerial music were French, half sad, half gay snatches of some long-dead singer of old France. I looked about for the origin of the sweet sounds, but in vain. Could it be the birds that were singing in French in this strange orchard? Presently, the voice seemed to come quite close to me, so near that it might have been the voice of a dryad singing to me out of the tree against which I was leaning. And this time I distinctly caught the words of the sad little song. Chante, rossignol, chante, toi qui as le cœur gai, tu as le cœur à rire, moi, je l'ai à pleurer. But, though the voice was at my shoulder, I could see no one, and then the singing stopped with what sounded like a sob. And a moment or two later, I seemed to hear a sound of sobbing far down the orchard. Then there followed silence, and I was left to ponder on the strange occurrence. Naturally, I decided that it was just a daydream, between sleeping and waking over the pages of an old book. Yet, when next day, and the day after, the invisible singer was in the orchard again, I could not be satisfied with such mere matter-of-fact explanation. À la claire fontaine went the voice to and fro through the thick orchard boughs. M'en allant promener, j'ai trouvé l'eau si belle que je m'y suis baignée. Lui, y a longtemps que je t'aime. Jamais je ne t'oubliais. It was certainly uncanny to hear that voice going to and fro the orchard, there somewhere amid the bright, sun-dazzled boughs, yet not a human creature to be seen, not another house even within half a mile. The most materialistic mind could hardly but conclude that here was something not dreamed of in our philosophy. It seemed to me that the only reasonable explanation was the entirely irrational one, that my orchard was haunted by some beautiful young spirit, with some sorrow of lost joy, that would not let her sleep quietly in her grave. And next day, I had a curious confirmation of my theory. Once more, I was lying under my favorite apple tree, half reading and half watching the sound, lulled into a dream by the whir of insects and the spices hauled up from the earth by the hot sun. As I bent over the page, I suddenly had the startling impression that someone was leaning over my shoulder and reading with me, and that a girl's long hair was falling over me down onto the page. The book was the Ronsard I had found in the little bedroom. I turned, but again there was nothing there. Yet this time I knew that I had not been dreaming, and I cried out, "Poor child, tell me of your grief, that I may help your sorrowing heart to rest." But, of course, there was no answer. Yet that night I dreamed a strange dream. I thought I was in the orchard again in the afternoon, and once again heard the strange singing. But this time, as I looked up, the singer was no longer invisible. Coming toward me was a young girl with wonderful blue eyes filled with tears, and gold hair that fell to her waist. She wore a straight white robe that might have been a shroud or a bridal dress. She appeared not to see me, though she came directly to the tree where I was sitting. And there she knelt and buried her face in the grass, and sobbed as if her heart would break. Her long hair fell over her like a mantle, and in my dream I stroked it pityingly and murmured words of comfort for a sorrow I did not understand. Then I woke suddenly, as one does from dreams. The moon was shining brightly into the room. Rising from my bed, I looked out into the orchard. It was almost as bright as day. I could plainly see the tree of which I had been dreaming, and then a fantastic notion possessed me. Slipping on my clothes, I went out into one of the old barns and found a spade. Then I went to the tree where I had seen the girl weeping in my dream, and dug down at its foot. I had dug little more than a foot, where my spade struck upon some hard substance, and in a few more moments I had uncovered and exhumed a small box, which, on examination, proved to be one of those pretty old-fashioned Chippendale work boxes, used by our grandmothers to keep their thimbles and needles in, their reels of cotton and skeins of silk. After smoothing down the little grave in which I had found it, I carried the box into the house, and under the lamplight examined its contents. Then, at once, I understood why that sad young spirit went to and fro the orchard, singing those little French songs, for the treasure trove I had found under the apple tree, the buried treasure of an unquiet, suffering soul, proved to be a number of love letters, written mostly in French in a very picturesque hand. Letters, too, written but some 5 or 6 years before. Perhaps I should not have read them, yet I read them, with such reverence for the beautiful, impassioned love that animated them and literally made them smell sweet and blossom in the dust, that I felt I had the sanction of the dead to make myself the confidant of their story. Among the letters were little songs, 2 of which I had heard the strange young voice singing in the orchard, and, of course, there were many withered flowers, and such like remembrances of bygone rapture. Not that night could I make out all the story, though it was not difficult to define its essential tragedy, and later on a gossip in the neighborhood and a headstone in the churchyard told me the rest. The unquiet young soul that had sung so wistfully to and fro the orchard was my landlord's daughter. She was the only child of her parents, a beautiful, willful girl, exotically unlike those from whom she was sprung, and among whom she lived with a disdainful air of exile. She was, as a child, a little creature of fairy fancies, and as she grew up, it was plain to her father and mother that she had come from another world than theirs. To them, she seemed like a child in an old fairy tale, strangely found on his hearth by some shepherd as he returns from the fields at evening. A little fairy girl swaddled in fine linen and dowered with a mysterious bag of gold. Soon, she developed delicate spiritual needs to which her simple parents were strangers. From long truancies in the woods, she would come home laden with mysterious flowers, and soon she came to ask for books and pictures and music, of which the poor souls that had given her birth had never heard. Finally, she had her way, and went to study at a certain fashionable college. And there, the brief romance of her life began. There she met a romantic young Frenchman who had read Ronsard to her and written her those picturesque letters I had found in the old mahogany workbox. And after a while, the young Frenchman had gone back to France, and the letters had ceased. Month by month went by, and at length one day, as she sat wistful at the window, looking out at the foolish sunlit road, a message came. He was dead. That headstone in the village churchyard tells the rest. She was very young to die, scarcely 19 years, and the dead who have died young, with all their hopes and dreams still like unfolded buds within their hearts, do not rest so quietly in the grave as those who have gone through the long day, from morning until evening, and are only too glad to sleep. Next day, I took the little box to a quiet corner of the orchard and made a little pyre of fragrant boughs, for so I interpreted the wish of that young, unquiet spirit. And the beautiful words are now safe, taken up again into the aerial spaces from which they came. But since then, the birds sing no more little French songs in my old orchard. At the gate, a shaggy Airedale scented his way along the high road. He had not been there before, but he was guided by the trail of his brethren, who had preceded him. He had gone unwillingly upon this journey, yet with the perfect training of dogs, he had accepted it without complaint. The path had been lonely, and his heart would have failed him, travelling as he must without his people, had not these traces of countless dogs before him promised companionship of a sort at the end of the road. The landscape had appeared arid at first, for the translation from recent agony into freedom from pain had been so numbing in its swiftness that it was some time before he could fully appreciate the pleasant dog country through which he was passing. There were woods with leaves upon the ground through which to scurry, long grassy slopes for extended runs, and lakes into which he might plunge for sticks and bring them back to. But he did not complete his thought, for the boy was not with him. A little wave of homesickness possessed him. It made his mind easier to see far ahead, a great gate as high as the heavens, wide enough for all. He understood that only man built such barriers, and by straining his eyes, he fancied he could discern humans passing through to whatever lay beyond. He broke into a run that he might the more quickly gain this enclosure, made beautiful by men and women. But his thoughts outran his pace, and he remembered that he had left the family behind. And again this lovely new compound became not perfect, since it would lack the family. The scent of the dogs grew very strong now, and coming nearer, he discovered, to his astonishment, that of the myriads of those who had arrived ahead of him, thousands were still gathered on the outside of the portal. They sat in a wide circle, spreading out on each side of the entrance. Big, little, curly, handsome, mongrel, thoroughbred dogs of every age, complexion, and personality. All were apparently waiting for something, someone, and at the pad of the Airedale's feet on the hard road, they arose and looked in his direction. That the interest passed as soon as they discovered the newcomer to be a dog puzzled him. In his former dwelling place, a 4-footed brother was greeted with enthusiasm when he was a friend, with suspicious diplomacy when a stranger, and with sharp reproof when an enemy. But never had he been utterly ignored. He remembered something that he had read many times on great buildings with lofty entrances. Dogs not admitted, the signs had said, and he feared this might be the reason for the waiting circle outside the gate. It might be that this noble portal stood as the dividing line between mere dogs and humans. But he had been a member of the family, romping with them in the living room, sitting at meals with them in the dining room, going upstairs at night with them, and the thought that he was to be kept out would be unendurable. He despised the passive dogs. They should be treating a barrier after the fashion of their old country, leaping against it, barking and scratching the nicely painted door. He bounded up the last little hill to set them an example, for he was still full of the rebellion of the world, but he found no door to leap against. He could see beyond the entrance dear masses of people, yet no dog crossed the threshold. They continued in their patient ring, their gaze upon the winding road. He now advanced cautiously to examine the gate. It occurred to him that it must be fly time in this region, and he did not wish to make himself ridiculous before all these strangers by trying to bolt through an invisible mesh, like the one that had baffled him when he was a little chap. Yet there were no screens, and despair entered his soul. What bitter punishment these poor beasts must have suffered before they learned to stay on this side the arch that led to human beings. What had they done on earth to merit this? Stolen bones troubled his conscience, runaway days, sleeping in the best chair until the key clicked in the lock. These were sins. At that moment, an English bull terrier, white with liver-coloured spots and a jaunty manner, approached him, snuffling in a friendly way. No sooner had the bull terrier smelt his collar than he fell to expressing his joy at meeting him. The Airedale's reserve was quite thawed by this welcome, though he did not know just what to make of it. "I know you! I know you!" exclaimed the bull terrier, adding inconsequently, "What's your name?" "Tam O'Shanter. They call me Tammy," was the answer, with a pardonable break in the voice. "I know them," said the bull terrier. "Nice folks." "Best ever," said the Airedale, trying to be nonchalant and scratching a flea which was not there. "I don't remember you. When did you know them?" "About 14 tags ago, when they were first married. We keep track of time here by the license tags." "I had 4. This is my first and only one. You were before my time, I guess." He felt young and shy. "Come for a walk and tell me all about them," was his new friend's invitation. "Aren't we allowed in there?" asked Tam, looking toward the gate. Sure, you can go in whenever you want to. Some of us do at first, but we don't stay. Like it better outside? No, it isn't that. Then why are all you fellows hanging around here? Any old dog can see it's better beyond the arch. You see, we're waiting for our folks to come. The Airedale grasped it at once and nodded understandingly. I felt that way when I came along the road. It wouldn't be what it's supposed to be without them. It wouldn't be the perfect place. Not to us, said the bull terrier. Fine, I've stolen bones, but it must be that I have been forgiven. If I'm to see them here again, it's the great good place, all right. But look here, he added, as a new thought struck him. Do they wait for us? The older inhabitant coughed in slight embarrassment. The humans couldn't do that very well. It wouldn't be the thing to have them hang around outside for just a dog, not dignified. Quite right, agreed Tam. I'm glad they go straight to their mansions. I'd hate to have them missing me as I am missing them. He sighed. But then they wouldn't have to wait so long. Oh, well, they're getting on. Don't be discouraged, comforted the terrier. And in the meantime, it's like a big hotel in summer, watching the new arrivals. See, there is something doing now. All the dogs were aroused to excitement by a little figure making its way uncertainly up the last slope. Half of them started to meet it, crowding about in a loving, eager pack. Look out, don't scare it, cautioned the older animals, while word was passed to those farthest from the gate. Quick, quick, a baby's come. Before they had entirely assembled, however, a gaunt yellow hound pushed through the crowd, gave one sniff at the small child, and with a yelp of joy crouched at its feet. The baby embraced the hound in recognition, and the two moved toward the gate. Just outside, the hound stopped to speak to an aristocratic Saint Bernard, who had been friendly. Sorry to leave you, old fellow, he said, but I'm going in to watch over the kid. You see, I'm all she has up here. The bull terrier looked at the Airedale for appreciation. That's the way we do it, he said proudly. Yes, but... The Airedale put his head on one side in perplexity. Yes, but what? Asked the guide. The dogs that don't have any people? The nobody's dogs? That's the best of all. Oh, everything is thought out here. Crouch down. You must be tired. And watch, said the bull terrier. Soon they spied another small form making the turn in the road. He wore a Boy Scout's uniform, but he was a little fearful for all that. So new was this adventure. The dogs rose again and snuffled, but the better groomed of the circle held back. And in their place, a pack of odds and ends of the company ran down to meet him. The Boy Scout was reassured by their friendly attitude, and after petting them impartially, he chose an old-fashioned black and tan, and the two passed in. Tam looked questioningly. They didn't know each other, he exclaimed, but they've always wanted to. That's one of the boys who used to beg for a dog, but his father wouldn't let him have one. So all our strays wait for just such little fellows to come along. Every boy gets a dog, and every dog gets a master. I expect the boy's father would like to know that now, commented the Airedale. No doubt he thinks quite often, I wish I'd let him have a dog. The bull terrier laughed. You're pretty near the earth yet, aren't you? Tam admitted it. I've a lot of sympathy with fathers and with boys, having them both in the family and a mother as well. The bull terrier leaped up in astonishment. You don't mean to say they keep a boy? Sure, greatest boy on earth, 10 this year. Well, this is news. I wish they'd kept a boy when I was there. The Airedale looked at his new friend intently. See here, who are you? He demanded. But the other hurried on. I used to run away from them just to play with a boy. They'd punish me, and I always wanted to tell them it was their fault for not getting one. Who are you, anyway? Repeated Tam, talking all this interest in me, too. Whose dog were you? You've already guessed. I see it in your quivering snout. I'm the old dog that had to leave them about 10 years ago. Their old dog, Bully? Yes, I'm Bully. They nosed each other with deeper affection, then strolled about the glades shoulder to shoulder. Bully the more eagerly pressed for news. Tell me, how are they getting along? Very well indeed. They've paid for the house. I suppose you occupy the kennel. No, they said they couldn't stand it to see another dog in your old place. Bully stopped to howl gently. That touches me. It's generous in you to tell it. To think they missed me. For a little while, they went on in silence, but as evening fell, and the light from the golden streets inside of the city gave the only glow to the scene, Bully grew nervous and suggested that they go back. We can't see so well at night, and I like to be pretty close to the path, especially toward morning. Tam assented. And I will point them out. You might not know them just at first. Oh, we know them. Sometimes the babies have so grown up, they're rather hazy in their recollection of how we look. They think we're bigger than we are, but you can't fool us dogs. It's understood, Tam cunningly arranged, that when he or she arrives, you'll sort of make them feel at home while I wait for the boy. That's the best plan, assented Bully kindly. And if by any chance the little fellow should come first, there's been a lot of them this summer. Of course you'll introduce me. I shall be proud to do it. And so, with muzzles sunk between their paws, and with their eyes straining down the pilgrim's road, they wait outside the gate. The Shadows on the Wall. From the Wind in the Rosebush by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. Copyright by Harper and Brothers. By permission of the publishers and Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. Henry had words with Edward in the study the night before Edward died, said Caroline Glynn. She spoke not with acrimony, but with grave severity. Rebecca Ann Glynn gasped by way of assent. She sat in a wide flounce of black silk in the corner of the sofa, and rolled terrified eyes from her sister, Caroline, to her sister Mrs. Stephen Brigham, who had been Emma Glynn, the one beauty of the family. The latter was beautiful still, with a large, splendid, full-blown beauty. She filled a great rocking chair with her superb bulk of femininity and swayed gently back and forth, her black silks whispering and her black frills fluttering. Even the shock of death, for her brother Edward lay dead in the house, could not disturb her outward serenity of demeanour. But even her expression of masterly placidity changed before her sister Caroline's announcement, and her sister Rebecca Ann's gasp of terror and distress in response. I think Henry might have controlled his temper when poor Edward was so near his end, she said, with an asperity which disturbed slightly the roseate curves of her beautiful mouth. Of course he did not know, murmured Rebecca Ann in a faint tone. Of course he did not know it, said Caroline quickly. She turned on her sister with a strange, sharp look of suspicion. Then she shrank, as if from the other's possible answer. Rebecca gasped again. The married sister, Mrs. Emma Brigham, was now sitting up straight in her chair. She had ceased rocking and was eyeing them both intently, with a sudden accentuation of family likeness in her face. "What do you mean?" said she impartially to them both. Then she, too, seemed to shrink before a possible answer. She even laughed an evasive sort of laugh. "Nobody means anything," said Caroline firmly. She rose and crossed the room toward the door, with grim decisiveness. "Where are you going?" asked Mrs. Brigham. "I have something to see to," replied Caroline, and the others at once knew by her tone that she had some solemn and sad duty to perform in the chamber of death. "Oh," said Mrs. Brigham. After the door had closed behind Caroline, she turned to Rebecca. "Did Henry have many words with him?" she asked. "They were talking very loud," replied Rebecca evasively. Mrs. Brigham looked at her. She had not resumed rocking. She still sat up straight, with a slight knitting of intensity on her fair forehead, between the pretty rippling curves of her auburn hair. "Did you ever hear anything?" she asked in a low voice with a glance toward the door. "I was just across the hall in the south parlour, and that door was open and this door ajar," replied Rebecca with a slight flush. "Then you must have—" "I couldn't help it." "Everything. Most of it." "What was it?" "The old story. I suppose Henry was mad, as he always was, because Edward was living on here for nothing, when he had wasted all the money father left him." Rebecca nodded, with a fearful glance at the door. When Emma spoke again, her voice was still more hushed. "I know how he felt," said she. "It must have looked to him as if Edward was living at his expense. But he wasn't. No, he wasn't. And Edward had a right here according to the terms of father's will, and Henry ought to have remembered it." "Yes, he ought." "Did he say hard things?" "Pretty hard, from what I heard." "What?" "I heard him tell Edward that he had no business here at all, and he thought he had better go away." "What did Edward say?" "That he would stay here as long as he lived, and afterward, too, if he was a mind to. And he would like to see Henry get him out. And then—" "What?" "Then he laughed." "What did Henry say?" "I didn't hear him say anything, but—" "But what?" "I saw him when he came out of this room." "He looked mad?" "You've seen him when he looked so." Emma nodded. The expression of horror on her face had deepened. "Do you remember that time he killed the cat because she had scratched him?" "Yes." "Don't!" Then Caroline re-entered the room. She went up to the stove in which a wood fire was burning. It was a cold, gloomy day of fall, and she warmed her hands, which were reddened from recent washing in cold water. Mrs. Brigham looked at her and hesitated. She glanced at the door, which was still ajar. It did not easily shut, being still swollen with the damp weather of the summer. She rose and pushed it together with a sharp, thud, which jarred the house. Rebecca started painfully with a half exclamation. Caroline looked at her disapprovingly. "It is time you controlled your nerves, Rebecca," she said. Mrs. Brigham, returning from the closed door, said imperiously that it ought to be fixed. It shut so hard. "It will shrink enough after we have had the fire a few days," replied Caroline. "I think Henry ought to be ashamed of himself for talking as he did to Edward," said Mrs. Brigham abruptly, but in an almost inaudible voice. "Hush," said Caroline, with a glance of actual fear at the closed door. "Nobody can hear with the door shut. I say again, I think Henry ought to be ashamed of himself. I shouldn't think he'd ever get over it, having words with poor Edward the very night before he died." Edward was enough sight better disposition than Henry, with all his faults. "I never heard him speak a cross word, unless he spoke cross to Henry that last night." "I don't know, but he did, from what Rebecca overheard." "Not so much cross as sort of soft and sweet and aggravating," sniffed Rebecca. "What do you really think ailed Edward?" asked Emma, in hardly more than a whisper. She did not look at her sister. "I know you said that he had terrible pains in his stomach and had spasms, but what do you think made him have them?" "Henry called it gastric trouble. You know Edward has always had dyspepsia." Mrs. Brigham hesitated a moment. "Was there any talk of an examination?" said she. Then Caroline turned on her fiercely. "No," said she in a terrible voice. "No." The three sisters' souls seemed to meet on one common ground of terrified understanding through their eyes. The old-fashioned latch of the door was heard to rattle, and a push from without made the door shake ineffectually. "It's Henry," Rebecca sighed rather than whispered. Mrs. Brigham settled herself after a noiseless rush across the floor, into her rocking chair again, and was swaying back and forth with her head comfortably leaning back, when the door at last yielded and Henry Glynn entered. He cast a covertly sharp, comprehensive glance at Mrs. Brigham with her elaborate calm, at Rebecca quietly huddled in the corner of the sofa with her handkerchief to her face, and only one small, uncovered, reddened ear, as attentive as a dog's, and at Caroline sitting with a strained composure in her armchair by the stove. She met his eyes quite firmly, with a look of inscrutable fear, and defiance of the fear and of him. Henry Glynn looked more like this sister than the others. Both had the same hard delicacy of form and aquilinity of feature. They confronted each other with the pitiless immovability of two statues, in whose marble lineaments emotions were fixed for all eternity. Then Henry Glynn smiled, and the smile transformed his face. He looked suddenly years younger, and an almost boyish recklessness appeared in his face. He flung himself into a chair with a gesture which was bewildering from its incongruity with his general appearance. He leaned his head back, flung one leg over the other, and looked laughingly at Mrs. Brigham. "I declare, Emma, you grow younger every year," he said. She flushed a little, and her placid mouth widened at the corners. She was susceptible to praise. "Our thoughts today ought to belong to the one of us who will never grow older," said Caroline in a hard voice. Henry looked at her, still smiling. "Of course, "We none of us forget that," said he, in a deep, gentle voice. "But we have to speak to the living, Caroline, and I have not seen Emma for a long time, and the living are as dear as the dead." "Not to me," said Caroline. She rose and went abruptly out of the room again. Rebecca also rose and hurried after her, sobbing loudly. Henry looked slowly after them. "Caroline is completely unstrung," said he. Mrs. Brigham rocked. A confidence in him, inspired by his manner, was stealing over her. Out of that confidence, she spoke quite easily and naturally. "His death was very sudden," said she. Henry's eyelids quivered slightly, but his gaze was unswerving. "Yes," said he, "it was very sudden. He was sick only a few hours." "What did you call it?" "Gastric." "You did not think of an examination?" "There was no need. I am perfectly certain as to the cause of his death." Suddenly, Mrs. Brigham felt a creep, as of some live horror, over her very soul. Her flesh prickled with cold before an inflection of his voice. She rose, tottering on weak knees. "Where are you going?" asked Henry in a strange, breathless voice. Mrs. Brigham said something incoherent about some sewing which she had to do, some black for the funeral, and was out of the room. She went up to the front chamber which she occupied. Caroline was there. She went close to her and took her hands, and the two sisters looked at each other. "Don't speak, don't. I won't have it," said Caroline finally, in an awful whisper. "I won't," replied Emma. That afternoon, the three sisters were in the study. Mrs. Brigham was hemming some black material. At last, she laid her work on her lap. "It's no use. I cannot see to sew another stitch until we have a light," said she. Caroline, who was writing some letters at the table, turned to Rebecca in her usual place on the sofa. "Rebecca, you had better get a lamp," she said. Rebecca started up. Even in the dusk, her face showed her agitation. "It doesn't seem to me that we need a lamp quite yet," she said, in a piteous, pleading voice, like a child's. "Yes, we do," returned Mrs. Brigham peremptorily. "I can't see to sew another stitch." Rebecca rose and left the room. Presently, she entered with a lamp. She set it on the table, an old-fashioned card table, which was placed against the opposite wall from the window. That opposite wall was taken up with 3 doors. The one small space was occupied by the table. "What have you put that lamp over there for?" asked Mrs. Brigham, with more of impatience than her voice usually revealed. "Why didn't you set it in the hall and have done with it? Neither Caroline nor I can see if it is on that table." "I thought perhaps you would move," replied Rebecca hoarsely. "If I do move, we can't both sit at that table. Caroline has her paper all spread around. Why don't you set the lamp on the study table in the middle of the room? Then we can both see." Rebecca hesitated. Her face was very pale. She looked with an appeal that was fairly agonizing at her sister Caroline. "Why don't you put the lamp on this table, as she says?" asked Caroline, almost fiercely. "Why do you act so, Rebecca?" Rebecca took the lamp and set it on the table in the middle of the room, without another word. Then she seated herself on the sofa and placed a hand over her eyes as if to shade them, and remained so. "Does the light hurt your eyes? And is that the reason why you didn't want the lamp?" asked Mrs. Brigham kindly. "I always like to sit in the dark," replied Rebecca chokingly. Then she snatched her handkerchief hastily from her pocket and began to weep. Caroline continued to write, Mrs. Brigham to sew. Suddenly, Mrs. Brigham, as she sewed, glanced at the opposite wall. The glance became a steady stare. She looked intently, her work suspended in her hands. Then she looked away again and took a few more stitches. Then she looked again and again turned to her task. At last, she laid her work in her lap and stared concentratedly. She looked from the wall round the room, taking note of the various objects. Then she turned to her sisters. "What is that?" said she. "What?" asked Caroline harshly. "That strange shadow on the wall," replied Mrs. Brigham. Rebecca sat with her face hidden. Caroline dipped her pen in the inkstand. "Why don't you turn around and look?" asked Mrs. Brigham, in a wondering and somewhat aggrieved way. "I am in a hurry to finish this letter," replied Caroline shortly. Mrs. Brigham rose, her work slipping to the floor, and began walking round the room, moving various articles of furniture with her eyes on the shadow. Then suddenly she shrieked out, "Look at this awful shadow! What is it? Caroline, look, look! Rebecca, look! What is it?" All Mrs. Brigham's triumphant placidity was gone. Her handsome face was livid with horror. She stood stiffly, pointing at the shadow. Then, after a shuddering glance at the wall, Rebecca burst out in a wild wail. "Oh, Caroline, there it is again! There it is again!" "Caroline Glynn, you look," said Mrs. Brigham. "Look, what is that dreadful shadow?" Caroline rose, turned, and stood confronting the wall. "How should I know?" she said. "It has been there every night since he died," cried Rebecca. "Every night?" "Yes, he died Thursday, and this is Saturday. That makes 3 nights," said Caroline rigidly. She stood as if holding her calm with a vice of concentrated will. It looks like, stammered Mrs. Brigham, in a tone of intense horror. "I know what it looks like well enough," said Caroline. "I've got eyes in my head." "It looks like Edward," burst out Rebecca, in a sort of frenzy of fear. "Only—" "Yes, it does," assented Mrs. Brigham, whose horror-stricken tone matched her sister's. "Only, oh, it is awful. What is it, Caroline?" "I ask you again, how should I know?" replied Caroline. "I see it there like you. How should I know any more than you?" "It must be something in the room," said Mrs. Brigham, staring wildly around. "We moved everything in the room the first night it came," said Rebecca. "It is not anything in the room." Caroline turned upon her with a sort of fury. "Of course it is something in the room," said she. "How you act! What do you mean talking so? Of course it is something in the room." "Of course it is," agreed Mrs. Brigham, looking at Caroline suspiciously. "It must be something in the room." "It is not anything in the room," repeated Rebecca with obstinate horror. The door opened suddenly and Henry Glynn entered. He began to speak, then his eyes followed the direction of the others. He stood, staring at the shadow on the wall. "What is that?" he demanded in a strange voice. "It must be due to something in the room," Mrs. Brigham said faintly. Henry Glynn stood and stared a moment longer. His face showed a gamut of emotions: horror, conviction, then furious incredulity. Suddenly, he began hastening hither and thither about the room. He moved the furniture with fierce jerks, turning ever to see the effect upon the shadow on the wall. Not a line of its terrible outlines wavered. "It must be something in the room," he declared, in a voice which seemed to snap like a lash. His face changed. The inmost secrecy of his nature seemed evident upon his face, until one almost lost sight of his lineaments. Rebecca stood close to her sofa, regarding him with woeful, fascinated eyes. Mrs. Brigham clutched Caroline's hand. They both stood in a corner out of his way. For a few moments he raged about the room like a caged wild animal. He moved every piece of furniture. When the moving of a piece did not affect the shadow, he flung it to the floor. Then suddenly he desisted. He laughed. "What an absurdity," he said easily. "Such a to-do about a shadow." "That's so," assented Mrs. Brigham, in a scared voice which she tried to make natural. As she spoke, she lifted a chair near her. "I think you have broken the chair that Edward was fond of," said Caroline. Terror and wrath were struggling for expression on her face. Her mouth was set, her eyes shrinking. Henry lifted the chair with a show of anxiety. "Just as good as ever," he said pleasantly. He laughed again, looking at his sisters. "Did I scare you?" he said. "I should think you might be used to me by this time. You know my way of wanting to leap to the bottom of a mystery, and that shadow does look queer, like, and I thought, if there was any way of accounting for it, I would like to without any delay." "You don't seem to have succeeded," remarked Caroline dryly, with a slight glance at the wall. Henry's eyes followed hers and he quivered perceptibly. "Oh, there is no accounting for shadows," he said, and he laughed again. "A man is a fool to try to account for shadows." Then the supper bell rang, and they all left the room, but Henry kept his back to the wall, as did, indeed, the others. Henry led the way with an alert motion like a boy. Rebecca brought up the rear. She could scarcely walk, her knees trembled so. "I can't sit in that room again this evening," she whispered to Caroline after supper. "Very well. We will sit in the south room," replied Caroline. "I think we will sit in the south parlour," she said aloud. "It isn't as damp as the study, and I have a cold." So they all sat in the south room with their sewing. Henry read the newspaper, his chair drawn close to the lamp on the table. About 9 o'clock, he rose abruptly and crossed the hall to the study. The three sisters looked at one another. Mrs. Brigham rose, folded her rustling skirts compactly round her, and began tiptoeing towards the door. "What are you going to do?" inquired Rebecca agitatedly. "I am going to see what he is about," replied Mrs. Brigham cautiously. As she spoke, she pointed to the study door across the hall. It was ajar. Henry had striven to pull it together behind him, but it had somehow swollen beyond the limit, with curious speed. It was still ajar, and a streak of light showed from top to bottom. Mrs. Brigham folded her skirts so tightly that her bulk, with its swelling curves, was revealed in a black silk sheath, and she went with a slow toddle across the hall to the study door. She stood there, her eye at the crack. In the south room, Rebecca stopped sewing and sat watching with dilated eyes. Caroline sewed steadily. What Mrs. Brigham, standing at the crack in the study door, saw was this. Henry Glynn, evidently reasoning that the source of the strange shadow must be between the table on which the lamp stood and the wall, was making systematic passes and thrusts with an old sword which had belonged to his father all over and through the intervening space. Not an inch was left unpierced. He seemed to have divided the space into mathematical sections. He brandished the sword with a sort of cold fury and calculation. The blade gave out flashes of light. The shadow remained unmoved. Mrs. Brigham, watching, felt herself cold with horror. Finally, Henry ceased and stood with the sword in hand and raised as if to strike, surveying the shadow on the wall threateningly. Mrs. Brigham toddled back across the hall and shut the south room door behind her before she related what she had seen. "He looked like a demon," she said again. "Have you got any of that old wine in the house, Caroline? I don't feel as if I could stand much more." "Yes, there's plenty," said Caroline. "You can have some when you go to bed." "I think we had all better take some," said Mrs. Brigham. "Oh, Caroline, what?" "Don't ask. Don't speak," said Caroline. "No, I'm not going to," replied Mrs. Brigham. But soon the three sisters went to their chambers, and the south parlour was deserted. Caroline called to Henry in the study to put out the light before he came upstairs. They had been gone about an hour when he came into the room bringing the lamp which had stood in the study. He set it on the table and waited a few minutes, pacing up and down. His face was terrible. His fair complexion showed livid, and his blue eyes seemed dark blanks of awful reflections. Then he took up the lamp and returned to the library. He set the lamp on the centre table, and the shadow sprang out on the wall. Again he studied the furniture and moved it about, but deliberately, with none of his former frenzy. Nothing affected the shadow. Then he returned to the south room with the lamp, and again waited. Again he returned to the study and placed the lamp on the table, and the shadow sprang out upon the wall. It was midnight before he went upstairs. Mrs. Brigham and the other sisters, who could not sleep, heard him. The next day was the funeral. That evening the family sat in the south room. Some relatives were with them. Nobody entered the study until Henry carried a lamp in there after the others had retired for the night. He saw again the shadow on the wall leap to an awful life before the light. The next morning at breakfast, Henry Glynn announced that he had to go to the city for 3 days. The sisters looked at him with surprise. He very seldom left home, and just now, his practice had been neglected on account of Edward's death. "How can you leave your patients now?" asked Mrs. Brigham wonderingly. "I don't know how to, but there is no other way," replied Henry easily. "I have had a telegram from Dr. Mitford." "Consultation?" inquired Mrs. Brigham. "I have business," replied Henry. Dr. Mitford was an old classmate of his who lived in a neighbouring city and who occasionally called upon him in the case of a consultation. After he had gone, Mrs. Brigham said to Caroline that, after all, Henry had not said that he was going to consult with Dr. Mitford, and she thought it very strange. "Everything is very strange," said Rebecca with a shudder. "What do you mean?" inquired Caroline. "Nothing," replied Rebecca. Nobody entered the study that day, nor the next. The third day, Henry was expected home, but he did not arrive, and the last train from the city had come. "I call it pretty queer work," said Mrs. Brigham. "The idea of a doctor leaving his patients at such a time as this, and the idea of a consultation lasting 3 days. There is no sense in it, and now he has not come. I don't understand it, for my part." "I don't either," said Rebecca. "They were all in the south parlour. There was no light in the study. The door was ajar." Presently Mrs. Brigham rose. She could not have told why. Something seemed to impel her, some will outside her own. She went out of the room, again wrapping her rustling skirts round that she might pass noiselessly, and began pushing at the swollen door of the study. "She has not got any lamp," said Rebecca in a shaking voice. Caroline, who was writing letters, rose again, took the only remaining lamp in the room, and followed her sister. Rebecca had risen, but she stood trembling, not venturing to follow. The doorbell rang, but the others did not hear it. It was on the south door on the other side of the house from the study. Rebecca, after hesitating until the bell rang the second time, went to the door. She remembered that the servant was out. Caroline and her sister Emma entered the study. Caroline set the lamp on the table. They looked at the wall, and there were 2 shadows. The sisters stood clutching each other, staring at the awful things on the wall. Then Rebecca came in, staggering with a telegram in her hand. "Here is a telegram," she gasped. "Henry is dead." A ghost. We were speaking of sequestration, alluding to a recent lawsuit. It was at the close of a friendly evening, in a very old mansion in the Rue de Grenelle, and each of the guests had a story to tell, which he assured us was true. Then the old Marquis de la Tour Samuel, 82 years of age, rose and came forward to lean on the mantelpiece. He told the following story in his slightly quavering voice. "I, also, have witnessed a strange thing, so strange that it has been the nightmare of my life. It happened 56 years ago, and yet there is not a month when I do not see it again in my dreams. From that day I have borne a mark, a stamp of fear. Do you understand? Yes, for 10 minutes I was a prey to terror, in such a way that ever since a constant dread has remained in my soul. Unexpected sounds chill me to the heart. Objects which I can ill distinguish in the evening shadows make me long to flee. I am afraid at night. No, I would not have owned such a thing before reaching my present age. But now I may tell everything. One may fear imaginary dangers at 82 years old. But before actual danger, I have never turned back, mesdames. That affair so upset my mind, filled me with such a deep, mysterious unrest, that I never could tell it. I kept it in that inmost part, that corner where we conceal our sad, our shameful secrets, all the weaknesses of our life, which cannot be confessed. I will tell you that a strange happening just as it took place, with no attempt to explain it. Unless I went mad for 1 short hour, it must be explainable though. Yet I was not mad, and I will prove it to you. Imagine what you will. Here are the simple facts. It was in 1827, in July. I was quartered with my regiment in Rouen. One day, as I was strolling on the quay, I came across a man I believed I recognized, though I could not place him with certainty. I instinctively went more slowly, ready to pause. The stranger saw my impulse, looked at me, and fell into my arms. It was a friend of my younger days, of whom I had been very fond. He seemed to have become half a century older in the 5 years since I had seen him. His hair was white, and he stooped in his walk as if he were exhausted. He understood my amazement and told me the story of his life. A terrible event had broken him down. He had fallen madly in love with a young girl and married her in a kind of dreamlike ecstasy. After a year of unalloyed bliss and unexhausted passion, she had died suddenly of heart disease, no doubt killed by love itself. He had left the country on the very day of her funeral and had come to live in his hotel at Rouen. He remained there, solitary and desperate, grief slowly mining him, so wretched that he constantly thought of suicide. "As I thus came across you again," he said, "I shall ask a great favor of you. I want you to go to my chateau and get some papers I urgently need. They are in the writing desk of my room, of our room. I cannot send a servant or a lawyer, as the errand must be kept private. I want absolute silence. I shall give you the key of the room, which I locked carefully myself before leaving, and the key to the writing desk. I shall also give you a note for the gardener, who will let you in. Come to breakfast with me tomorrow, and we'll talk the matter over. I promise to render him that slight service. It would mean but a pleasant excursion for me, his home not being more than 25 miles from Rouen. I could go there in an hour on horseback. At 10 o'clock the next day, I was with him. We breakfasted alone together, yet he did not utter more than 20 words. He asked me to excuse him. The thought that I was going to visit the room where his happiness lay shattered upset him, he said. Indeed, he seemed perturbed, worried, as if some mysterious struggle were taking place in his soul. At last he explained exactly what I was to do. It was very simple. I was to take 2 packages of letters and some papers, locked in the first drawer at the right of the desk, of which I had the key. He added, "I need not ask you not to glance at them." I was almost hurt by his words and told him so, rather sharply. He stammered, "Forgive me, I suffer so much," and tears came to his eyes. I left about 1 o'clock to accomplish my errand. The day was radiant, and I rushed through the meadows, listening to the song of the larks and the rhythmical beat of my sword on my riding boots. Then I entered the forest, and I set my horse to walking. Branches of the trees softly caressed my face, and now and then I would catch a leaf between my teeth and bite it with avidity, full of the joy of life, such as fills you without reason, with a tumultuous happiness almost indefinable, a kind of magical strength. As I neared the house, I took out the letter for the gardener and noted with surprise that it was sealed. I was so amazed and so annoyed that I almost turned back without fulfilling my mission. Then I thought that I should thus display oversensitiveness and bad taste. My friend might have sealed it unconsciously, worried as he was. The manor looked as though it had been deserted the last 20 years. The gate, wide open and rotten, held. One wondered how. Grass filled the paths. You could not tell the flower beds from the lawn. At the noise I made kicking a shutter, an old man came out from a side door and was apparently amazed to see me there. I dismounted from my horse and gave him the letter. He read it once or twice, turned it over, looked at me with suspicion, and asked, Well, what do you want? I answered sharply. You must know it, as you have read your master's orders. I want to get in the house. He appeared overwhelmed. He said, So, you are going in his room? I was getting impatient. Parbleu, do you intend to question me by chance? He stammered, No, monsieur, only it has not been opened since the death. If you will wait 5 minutes, I will go in to see whether... I interrupted angrily. See here, are you joking? You can't go in that room, as I have the key. He no longer knew what to say. Then, monsieur, I will show you the way. Show me the stairs and leave me alone. I can find it without your help. But still, monsieur, then I lost my temper. Now be quiet, else you'll be sorry. I roughly pushed him aside and went into the house. I first went through the kitchen, then crossed 2 small rooms occupied by the man and his wife. From there, I stepped into a large hall. I went up the stairs, and I recognized the door my friend had described to me. I opened it with ease and went in. The room was so dark that at first I could not distinguish anything. I paused, arrested by that mouldy and stale odor peculiar to deserted and condemned rooms, of dead rooms. Then gradually my eyes grew accustomed to the gloom, and I saw rather clearly a great room in disorder. A bed without sheets, having still its mattresses and pillows, one of which bore the deep print of an elbow or a head, as if someone had just been resting on it. The chairs seemed all in confusion. I noticed that a door, probably that of a closet, had remained ajar. I first went to the window and opened it to get some light, but the hinges of the outside shutters were so rusted that I could not loosen them. I even tried to break them with my sword, but did not succeed. As those fruitless attempts irritated me, and as my eyes were by now adjusted to the dim light, I gave up hope of getting more light and went toward the writing desk. I sat down in an armchair, folded back the top, and opened the drawer. It was full to the edge. I needed but 3 packages, which I knew how to distinguish, and I started looking for them. I was straining my eyes to decipher the inscriptions when I thought I heard, or rather felt a rustle behind me. I took no notice, thinking a draught had lifted some curtain. But a minute later, another movement, almost indistinct, sent a disagreeable little shiver over my skin. It was so ridiculous to be moved thus even so slightly, that I would not turn round, being ashamed. I had just discovered the second package I needed, and was on the point of reaching for the third, when a great and sorrowful sigh, close to my shoulder, made me give a mad leap 2 yards away. In my spring, I had turned round, my hand on the hilt of my sword, and surely, had I not felt that, I should have fled like a coward. A tall woman, dressed in white, was facing me, standing behind the chair in which I had sat a second before. Such a shudder ran through me that I almost fell back. Oh, no one who has not felt them can understand those gruesome and ridiculous terrors. The soul melts, your heart seems to stop, your whole body becomes limp as a sponge, and your innermost parts seem collapsing. I do not believe in ghosts, and yet I broke down before the hideous fear of the dead, and I suffered. Oh, I suffered more in a few minutes in the irresistible anguish of supernatural dread than I have suffered in all the rest of my life. If she had not spoken, I might have died. But she did speak. She spoke in a soft and plaintive voice, which set my nerves vibrating. I could not say that I regained my self-control. No, I was past knowing what I did, but the kind of pride I have in me, as well as a military pride, helped me to maintain, almost in spite of myself, an honourable countenance. I was making a pose for myself and for her, whatever she was, woman or phantom. I realised this later, for at the time of the apparition, I could think of nothing. I was afraid. She said, "Oh, you can be of great help to me, monsieur." I tried to answer, but I was unable to utter one word. A vague sound came from my throat. She continued, "Will you? You can save me, cure me. I suffer terribly. I always suffer. I suffer. Oh, I suffer." And she sat down gently in my chair. She looked at me. "Will you?" I nodded my head, being still paralyzed. Then she handed me a woman's comb of tortoiseshell and murmured, "Comb my hair. Oh, comb my hair. That will cure me. Look at my head, how I suffer, and my hair, how it hurts." Her loose hair, very long, very black, it seemed to me, hung over the back of the chair, touching the floor. Why did I do it? Why did I, shivering, accept that comb? And why did I take between my hands her long hair, which left on my skin a ghastly impression of cold, as if I had handled serpents? I do not know. That feeling still clings about my fingers, and I shiver when I recall it. I combed her, I handled, I know not how, that hair of ice. I bound and unbound it. I plaited it as one plaits a horse's mane. She sighed, bent her head, seemed happy. Suddenly she said, "Thank you," tore the comb from my hands, and fled through the door, which I had noticed was half opened. Left alone, I had for a few seconds the hazy feeling one feels in waking up from a nightmare. Then I recovered myself. I ran to the window and broke the shutters by my furious assault. A stream of light poured in. I rushed to the door through which that being had gone. I found it locked and immovable. Then a fever of flight seized on me, a panic, the true panic of battle. I quickly grasped the 3 packages of letters from the open desk. I crossed the room running. I took the steps of the stairway, 4 at a time. I found myself outside, I don't know how. And seeing my horse close by, I mounted in one leap and left at a full gallop. I didn't stop till I reached Rouen and drew up in front of my house. Having thrown the reins to my orderly, I flew to my room and locked myself in to think. Then for an hour, I asked myself whether I had not been the victim of an hallucination. Certainly, I must have had one of those nervous shocks, one of those brain disorders such as give rise to miracles to which the supernatural owes its strength. And I had almost concluded that it was a vision, an illusion of my senses, when I came near to the window. My eyes by chance looked down. My tunic was covered with hairs, long woman's hairs, which had entangled themselves around the buttons. I took them off one by one and threw them out of the window with trembling fingers. I then called my orderly. I felt too perturbed, too moved to go and see my friend on that day. Besides, I needed to think over what I should tell him. I had his letters delivered to him. He gave a receipt to the soldier. He inquired after me and was told that I was not well. I had had a sunstroke or something. He seemed distressed. I went to see him the next day, early in the morning, bent on telling him the truth. He had gone out the evening before and had not come back. I returned the same day, but he had not been seen. I waited a week. He did not come back. I notified the police. They searched for him everywhere, but no one could find any trace of his passing or of his retreat. A careful search was made in the deserted manor. No suspicious clue was discovered. There was no sign that a woman had been concealed there. The inquest gave no result, and so the search went no further. And in 56 years, I have learned nothing more. I never found out the truth. Thank you for spending this evening in the Haunted Wing. We hope the stories you've heard tonight remain with you, but not too closely. Until our next gathering, keep your candle burning and your place in the book. Membership in the Old Ink Society is always open.